Hello, Professor Kent Lee here. Welcome to another video on academic writing. And in this video, I'm going to start talking about academic papers and how to read academic papers. So first, in this video, I'm going to talk more about what academic papers are like, so you can understand what these creatures are. And then in the next video, I'll go more into particular strategies for reading and understanding academic papers. Before I can do that, in this video, I need to talk more about, what academic papers are. So I'm going to talk about the characteristics, features of academic papers, types of academic papers that are out there, and there are different ways of talking about types of papers, the structure of academic scholarly research papers, a little bit about finding papers, and in the next video, reading strategies for papers. So first, let's talk about the characteristics of papers. I mean, what are these things? What are we talking about? These are usually published in academic research journals, like this, or like this, that come out like maybe, certain number of times a year, 4 times a year, once a month, twice a year. Depends a lot on the type of journal that you're talking about. But these are for disseminating, that is, spreading original academic research, scholarly research, scientific research, social science research, whatever. These are original ideas or unique discoveries, experiments, or some scholars kind of unique new analysis, fresh analysis of something. They should be original research, original ideas. They're based on, of course, other research in some way, but this is the writer's own original research, scholarly research or scientific research or academic research of some kind. So it's different from professional sources like, Business Insider or Wall Street Journal, because it's original research by a scholar or by a scientist, not just somebody with a master's degree who is, writing an analytical piece for the Wall Street Journal, but we're talking about, solid academic research by academic people. So it's written by academic experts, professors, researchers, PhD students who are academic experts in training. And it's written for an academic audience, fellow professors, researchers, graduate students, but also if you're a college student in a 3rd or 4th year class, you'll probably be reading these kinds of papers in some of your classes because you are sort of an academic person in training. You're not to their level, of course, but you're at a level where you need to start reading scholarly or scientific research on the topic of your class. So it's written for academic audiences, whether they're very expert, like professors and PhD students, or maybe more of a beginner, like maybe you're more of a beginner, and it's written for various academic audiences. Structure. Okay, academic articles have a certain structure. In some cases, it may be a very specific structure that's used throughout papers in a particular field. Sometimes the structure is a bit looser. I'll say more about the structure later, but usually there is a well-defined structure in academic articles. Support. So let's say the writer is presenting an argument. The writer has to provide support for whatever the argument is. The argument of the whole paper, the point of the whole paper, has to be well supported. Maybe the writer has a research hypothesis that the writer is trying to prove or disprove. The writer needs to support that, maybe with experimental data, observational data, or a really good analysis. Whatever it is, the writer needs to support it. Then within the paper, for example, within the various paragraphs and sections of the paper, there are specific claims the writer makes in order to support his or her main point of the whole paper. Those require support, clear support. So, for example, if I look at a paper on kind of applied linguistics, language education research, let's say the writer does an experiment, and then in the discussion section, the writer says things like, the results of experiment 1 proved my first hypothesis, and the writer needs to explain that, provide support. Or for example, the finding of this result shows that such and such a approach or such can be a useful teaching method for developing such and such. Then the writer needs to explain and provide support. Or here's a literature analysis paper where maybe the writer says the novel's well-structured plot of a personal narrative does such and such, and then the writer needs to provide specific support, some kind of supporting arguments or evidence. It could be evidence from research. It could be in a literature paper evidence from the novel that the person is interpreting and analyzing, or something like that. So each paragraph, each section needs clear support that would convince a skeptical, educated reader, an academic reader, or a well-educated reader. The level of support and argumentation that's expected is much higher than for a professional, just for professional writing or general or popular kinds of writing, because academic people are very skeptical. That support can include sources. And so the sources, for example, would be used to support the writer's arguments and claims. The beginning of the paper, for example, the writer is going to look at other sources on the same topic, a similar topic, in order to show, why do I need to do this research? Well, these are what some other people have done, their research. They haven't really looked at this question, so I'm going to do this study. Or maybe they did look at that question, but not well enough, so I'm going to do this study in order to do a better job of that. Then, when the writer is making claims, like, well, the findings of this study show that, the writer needs support, and that support can include sources as well as to help explain the experimental results. Or the literature paper, the writer is, saying, well, the novelist does this, but then quote other sources to explain how and why in order to make the point. There's also quality control involved in the process of academic articles that's different from other sources, different from professional sources and popular sources. Let's say if I want to submit an article to this journal, it's an applied linguistics journal, I will send my research paper, my manuscript, to the editor. The editor will first look at it and decide if it's generally within the kind of scope of this research journal, and then find maybe 3 experts or people who are close enough who have knowledge of the topic, probably other professors somewhere out there, and say, hey, would you be willing to read this article and critique it and provide feedback? The reviewers won't know who the author is. The author won't ever know who the reviewers are. So we call it a double-blind review. That's the process that's followed by better journals, a blind review process where they don't know each other. Only the editor knows. And the reviewers provide their feedback. Maybe they'll say, sorry, this is not good enough, or sorry, this is not right for our journal. Or they'll say, we'll accept if you make some changes, some modifications. So there's kind of a back and forth exchange between the authors and the reviewers who don't know each other. And eventually, if it's good enough, the reviewers tell the editor, okay, it's good enough, it's ready to go, and it gets published. This is a quality control. It's called peer review. It's a peer review process, and it's a sort of what we call vetting, that is filtering, quality control, to make sure that better stuff gets into the journal and not so good stuff doesn't get in. So there's a quality control process here. Now, types of publications. So what we are talking about in terms of academic research articles, academic papers, are usually things that are published in academic research journals. Now, if you are kind of a beginner, a new person to the field, like you're in a 3rd or 4th year college class, you're probably not going to read the most difficult ones from like the really top world-class journals, but maybe journals that are maybe a little bit easier and such for a student to read. So there are various types of academic research journals. Some are really top, where they're extremely picky about the articles that they publish. And then there are some like this. This is published in Korea. It's actually a good one. It's one of the better ones that's published in Korea in English. But it's probably something that maybe a lot of college students might be able to read with enough background knowledge. These are academic research journals like this. These are published by professional academic organizations or maybe by universities every 1 week, every 2 weeks, 1 month, every month, 2 months, 3 months, whatever. They're published regularly by some kind of a research organization or academic organization. These are most often what we mean by academic research journals. They've gone through this review process with an editor who works for some academic research organization. So there's some quality behind it and a reputation behind it. Now, occasionally it might be an article that's published in a special book. It's called an edited volume, where it's a collection of new original papers on a particular topic by different authors. So these are original research papers. It's not a regular journal, but it's just a one-time book. It's called an edited volume. There's an editor in charge of the whole thing. You might read some of these in some of your classes, maybe more often in humanities or social science fields. So edited volumes, I'm not going to talk much about those because those are probably less common and less relevant to the typical student right now. There are some other kinds of papers which you're probably not likely to use if you're a college student, or I don't recommend them. Unless you're maybe a graduate student and you know the field well enough that you can judge, oh, this is a good paper or not. One might be a conference paper, or it's called a conference proceeding. So maybe a PhD student or professor presents some research at a conference, and maybe it's kind of their first analysis, or maybe it's a small research project, and it gets published by the conference, an academic research conference, as a conference paper, or maybe called a proceeding. Those may or may not be good. They're usually like someone's first analysis, and maybe they'll do much more detailed analysis and publish it later as a regular academic journal article, or it might be just a small study that somebody did and say, let's do this as a conference. Then there are technical reports, like some agencies, research institutes, universities might publish some occasional technical report. And I'm not going to talk about those. It's something you're less likely to deal with unless you're a professor or a graduate student. Monographs, I'm not going to talk about that because those are not articles. A monograph is a whole book by a scholar or researcher on the person's research topic. It's a combination of original research by the person as well as kind of a overview of other research in the field, but it's like a whole book and it's beyond the scope of this video. Then there are doctoral dissertations, master's theses, and again, I don't recommend that you use these unless you are a doctoral student or a professor and you can judge the quality of a PhD dissertation. Master's thesis, probably not. It's some person's first attempt at original research, and it's usually not something you would cite in an academic paper, usually. So I would say if you're a student, stay away from those unless you really know what you're doing. And a dissertation is long. It could be 100 pages or 300 pages or more. It's not an article. So here we're going to focus on articles, academic research articles. All right, so we can distinguish types of articles by sort of genre. So genre in literature is like things like novels, short story, poems. But in academic writing, we can talk about genre in terms of similar distinctions. That is, can think about a short story or a novel. There are differences in terms of the author, the audience, the purpose. Well, here with academic writing, academic articles, we can kind of think about different genres. That is, purposes in writing and the way that they write the general paper. A paper could be theoretical. So, for example, if it's a literature study, literature research, it may be theoretical. It may be a theoretical analysis of a poem or a novel or a short story by the author. Theoretical research is more theoretical arguments. It might be based on a piece of literature, or it could be purely theoretical situations and arguments like in some philosophy papers. Certain areas of theoretical linguistics can be just purely theoretical arguments based on a theory and maybe some sort of data of sorts, so to speak. A theoretical linguist might, as data used, like, well, these are sentences that people can or would not say in the language, but it's mainly theoretical. The arguments are theoretical. The research methods are mainly theoretical. They're using theoretical ways of arriving at their conclusions or proving things. The opposite end is empirical. So empirical means the researchers get some kind of real data. It could be more observational data, like observing what a group of people are doing, like an anthropologist observing some tribe of people, or a person observing a classroom and how the students are interacting. It could be more research data, experimental data. The person does an experiment, so that's empirical. So it could be an empirical paper where the person has collected or used actual observational or experimental data to explore something or to prove something. Empirical paper. It could be a case study where a person, and that's sort of observational. It's like observational empirical study too. It's a detailed study of one particular case, one particular instance, to analyze it. So it could be, for example, a medical case study. A doctor writes a research article about a particular patient who had some unusual new set of symptoms, and how the doctor diagnosed the patient and how she treated the patient, things like that. That is a case study. It could be a psychologist similarly writing about a particular patient and his or her symptoms and the causes and the treatment. It could be a business case study. You look at one particular company, describe its history and how it rose to success, or why it failed, or what it should do, something like that, a case study. Review paper is where a researcher looks at other published studies on the topic and kind of reviews them and synthesizes them together. Let's say, what are the different studies say about this kind of psychological relationship or this kind of language learning method. They kind of synthesize results from multiple studies and put them together and kind of critique them and analyze them. That's a review paper. An applied paper might be something similar, where they look at empirical research or theoretical research and say, how do we apply this? If we look at theoretical or empirical papers on, say, how students learn this particular grammar structure, well, what if we compare all this and then say, okay, what would this mean for maybe coming up with some new teaching method for teaching this? So in other words, it's focusing on some kind of an application. It's looking at theoretical or empirical papers and then trying to come up with some kind of application, a new teaching method, a new method of therapy, or something like that, applied papers. Now, rhetorical styles or modes. So rhetorical is like argumentation, persuasion, how you persuade people, and how you present information in a paper. So a single paper might have more than one of these. Very well may will have more than one of these. A lot of, actually, in general, academic writing is overall argumentative or persuasive. You're trying to persuade someone. If it's a literature paper, you're trying to persuade somebody that my analysis of this piece of literature is valid. It's not necessarily the one correct way, but you're saying it's valid, it makes sense, it helps us to understand this literature better. If it's an experiment, you're trying to say my experiment proves a hypothesis. So scientific papers, too, can be, in a sense, persuasive or argumentative. You're trying to persuade people, convince people, my experiment proved something, or my experiment did something cool, or we know something now because of my experiment. You're trying to prove a hypothesis and show that you've proven it and that it is somehow interesting or relevant. So in doing so, there might sometimes be, of course, pure argumentation, logical argumentation, logical arguments. Think of a philosophy paper as a prime example. There might be descriptive elements. You're describing, okay, what happens to this character in a novel. If it's a history research paper, maybe you're describing some historical events, or likewise in a political science analysis paper. Some parts might be descriptive. That can be part of some papers. Describing something maybe as background or as to show what you're going to analyze. And of course, empirical, as you said, present some data, analyze it in order to show something, to show or demonstrate or maybe even prove something. Of course, analytical, that literally means like taking things apart, so tearing things apart so you can logically analyze the data. This overlaps with empirical, of course, a lot. So analyzing things to understand them, kind of breaking them down in order to understand them and explain them. And along with that, sometimes problem solution. This can overlap with analytical. You analyze a problem and then propose a solution. This would be the best solution for this problem. Some types of analysis and logical argumentation might be inductive, where you look at maybe data or information, and then you lead the reader to a logical conclusion. You look at maybe what's going on in a country, and from all of these pieces of information and data, for example, you lead the reader to a particular conclusion, or you construct a philosophical argument, you provide maybe hypothetical situations and arguments and cases, and lead the reader to a conclusion based on some facts or information. Kind of the opposite of that almost many times is empirical, where you're presenting evidence. You might start with a research hypothesis and do an experiment and prove, okay, the results prove my hypothesis or the results disprove my hypothesis. So many times it can be the opposite or the converse of an inductive kind of argumentation. Critical is a bit different. I don't mean like criticizing something, but critiquing, often within a theoretical framework. So a good example would be in sociology, where you use some kind of theory in sociology and you look at maybe a particular case and you use this theory to critique something. Maybe you critique an education system and according to your theory, whether it's working like it should or not. Kind of critiquing and evaluating, examining the good aspects and the negative aspects, critiquing. Or use a particular theory and you look at, say, an education system again, and according to your theory, are there signs here of, say, racism in this school system? Or you look at how a particular law is written and maybe use a particular sociology theory or linguistic theory to critique the way the law is written. Are the intentions maybe showing signs of racism, institutional racism, or unfairness, or bias, or gender bias, or things like that? So using a theory to critique and evaluate something. Or is this school system really effective according to educational criteria? Interpretive, take for literature, for example, you interpret something, maybe using a framework like literary theory to interpret a novel, to interpret a poem. And this may be your own unique interpretation, and you're trying to show that your interpretation is valid, it makes sense, and it sheds some new light on this. You're interpreting thing, or use some kind of a sociology theory to interpret what is happening in a particular country or in a particular part of a society now. You're interpreting things maybe based on a theory. So critical and interpretive kind of overlap because oftentimes you're using some particular theory in order to interpret or to critique something. So next we have inference or best explanation, or occasionally a fancy term for this is optimization logic, and there's some other terms, which don't worry about. This might be used for analyzing a complex situation where there might be several possible explanations, and you kind of look at different explanations and say, this is the best one. So let's say, for example, why did Clinton lose the election in 2016? Well, you could look at this explanation, or you can look at this explanation, and say, well, this is the best explanation. Hypothesis A and B, they don't explain everything so well, but this one explains things pretty well. Or maybe it's a combination of A and B that explain certain things, but you're looking at the best explanation. Or you're looking at some complex situation within a country, or in some case in international relations, and why countries behave this way or why something happened, and you look at A and B and they don't explain everything so well, but C explains things much better. This is the best explanation. Current example is the Russian-Ukraine war going on right now, and it seems like Russia is doing horribly bad. Their military is really failing. What's the best explanation? And if you look at, let's say, what's going on in this part of the country, in this part of the country, in this part of the country, and why the Russian military is stuck, what's going on here? What's the best explanation for this? Is it because of A or B, or is it C? You look at different possibilities and examine the data and kind of inductively say, this is the best explanation. So it's sort of empirical in that you're doing kind of maybe a case study, a complex case study, and you're kind of inductively arriving at the best explanation. So it has elements of some of these others.